title of this session is Pot, Fast Horses, and Cocaine Cowboys. We have three panelists. Emily Dufton, starting all the way over on my left. She is a historian and a writer. She received her PhD in American Studies from George Washington University. Grassroots is her first book and is based off of her dissertation. Her next book will be on the meth and opioid epidemics. And she's researching for that project right now. Right now. Roben Farzad, to my immediate left. He hosts a weekly podcast called Full Disclosure on NPR. Some of you may have heard it. He's a special correspondent on the PBS NewsHour. He was previously a senior writer for Bloomberg Business Week, where he covered Wall Street, international finance, and Latin America. He's a graduate of Princeton University and Harvard Business School. And then finally, Joe Tone, who's in the middle. He's also a journalist, and he's an author who lives in Washington, D.C. So we have two people from Washington, D.C. You guys could have carpooled. His award-winning writing has appeared in the Washington Post, The Village Voice, Deadspin, and elsewhere. Bones is his first novel, and it was called Masterfully Recounted by the New York Times Book Review, and he's a finalist for the PEN America Award for Literary Sports Writing. So welcome to all of our panelists. I want to start off by asking them a couple questions about these projects that they've been involved in. I read all three of the books. They're really amazing reads, really easy to get through, and gives a very nice historical overview of cocaine and marijuana in the U.S. So I'm interested to hear from all of you in terms of what motivated you to write these books, and what was some of the, or maybe at least one, very crazy experience that you had in researching for this book, because I'm pretty sure you had some of those.
Emily.
All right, because I rolled in late trying to get my hair.
First one to go.
Last one here. I was trying to get my toddler to nap. Sorry, but I'm here. My motivations were manyfold. 15 years ago, ironically, the United States invaded Iraq, and I was an undergrad at NYU at the time. I took a bus down to Washington, D.C., and I was protesting the invasion of Iraq. And I remember walking around the mall and seeing drum circles and tie-dye and things like that, and I remember thinking to myself, this didn't work 40 years ago when we were invading Vietnam, and I don't think it's going to work today, and it didn't, right? So I became very interested in studying social movements, grassroots organization, and protest, and trying to understand what would make it work and why certain organizations succeeded and why certain ones failed. When I got into grad school, I started in 2008, I went through my classwork, I did my comprehensive exams, and in 2010 I was starting to write my dissertation, and I was searching around for a topic that would allow me to make some contribution to, the field as a whole. And I was very interested in drug history, but I was also really interested in social movements themselves. What made them effective? What made them influential, right? How did a bunch of people who were not, members of the political elite, how did they influence how the political elite made their decisions? So I started researching actually the anti-marijuana movement that formed in the 1970s in the wake of the decriminalization movement that passed from about 1973 to 1978. It was the parent movement, as they became known. It was parents who were very worried about their children starting to smoke marijuana, and rates of adolescent marijuana use really did rise in the 1970s. This group of parents across the country, they were in every state, there were thousands of them. They had a national lobbying organization right outside of Washington, D.C. in Silver Spring. They deeply influenced how the Reagan administration executed its war on drugs. They were the biggest influence on why Nancy Reagan is so deeply associated with Just Say No, which is a program she stole from an African-American grandmother in Oakland, California. By the way, fascinating stuff. So I researched the parent movement for my dissertation, and then when I thought about turning the dissertation into a book, I realized that's only part of the story. The parent movement didn't form in a vacuum. They formed in response to widespread activism for the expansion of marijuana rights in the 1970s, and because they then recriminalized the drug in the 1980s and 90s, there was a movement then to legalize the drug as far as medical marijuana and now recreational marijuana is concerned from the 1990s to today. So this pendulum moving back and forth between criminalization, legalization, between the demonization of the drug and the acceptance of the drug, that formed the basis of my research, and that forms basically the book. As far as the crazy experience I've had, oh, where to begin? The biggest thing, and I'm sure my other panelists can attest to this, is when you write about drugs, people make a lot of assumptions about you as the author. So I had a lot of people tell me that they just assumed, of course, that I'm also a drug user. And then a lot of people assumed, no, you're this nice young girl. You couldn't possibly use drugs, right? So I guess the assumptions and the judgments made upon me as a writer who is interested in studying marijuana as a historical artifact, as a historical subject, was probably the most interesting thing. In addition to the fact that I did over 24 interviews for this book, and the people who I spoke to, even if they were involved in these movements 20, 30, 40 years ago, they remain as committed and 100% on board for whatever side they were on then. They're still on it now. These waters run deep. That's all I can say. So I think the sheer commitment of the people I talked to and the judgments that they would immediately pass upon me, as someone who's interested in this as a historical subject, were probably the craziest experiences I had. So I'm interested in hearing the rest of the panelists.
All right, what motivated me? I don't know if this is exactly what you're looking for, but it's totally true. So I was mostly motivated by money and wanting to have it. Wanting to feed my children. And writing a book is not a good way to make money, just for the record. But no, it sort of was that and survival as a storyteller and an artist and a journalist. I've been a journalist my whole career. I worked in newspapers for 10 or 12 years or so, and I worked for the same publishing company for about 10 years. And I was done with them, and they were done with me, but I was still working there, and I really wanted to keep working in the industry, and I really wanted to write, and I hadn't been writing, because once you write for a while, and they make you an editor, and then you have to stop writing. It's sort of ironic. And I was casting about for something else to do, and I was really struggling to figure out what that was going to be, and I was pretty close to quitting. I was actually trying to quit and trying to find something to do outside of the industry. And my wife, God bless her heart, kind of pumped the brakes on that and said, no, you can't do that. This is what you love, and so you need to write your way out of this problem. Which I really liked. Those were her words, and I liked that. She knew what I wanted to do, and so she really encouraged me to just write, and then something will come. So I started shirking my responsibilities as the editor of this newspaper and closing my office door and writing, just finding different stories to tell. And one of them, before this one, felt like it could be a book. And so I started to see that as a possible new thing to me. And it didn't work out, but through that process I met my book agent. And so we had this ongoing relationship. And then I stumbled on to this story, which I'm going to tell you more about, but in the beginning, basically what it looked like was a rookie FBI agent had essentially fallen into this case where he was investigating Los Zetas, one of the most feared and dangerous criminal organizations in the world, which was, he believed, laundering its drug money through American horse racing. So I thought, well, that's cool. And I told that story. And it turned into this book, and now I'm still writing. So that really was my motivation. It wasn't, I came to have a lot of really strong feelings about the subject, but if I'm being totally honest, it was completely opportunistic. It was a story that I stumbled onto, I told it, and I thought, I want to keep writing, and I want to write that as a book. And I ended up having some really interesting experiences. Just sort of traipsing around tracks and breeding farms, just strolling up to people to ask them about Los Zetas is always interesting. They're super excited to talk to me about it. I think the one that always stands out to me was there's a character in the book. His name's Tyler Graham. If you read it, you'll come across him. He's this wealthy white rancher from Central Texas who had sort of gotten mixed up in all of this and had become an informant for the government, a secret informant for the FBI, helping them unravel this case. So he's basically snitching, to use the phrase, on Los Zetas. And most of the research for this was done after the fact. It's essentially reconstructed from interviews with people and court documents and other paper. But Tyler's story had sort of continued on, and he had, after all the dust had settled, he magically had been in possession of these great racehorses that had been involved in the story. So I wanted to go see one of these horses race. And I didn't think he would be there. I thought he should be in the witness protection program. A lot of people did, and he wasn't, which I thought was gutsy. I certainly didn't think he would just be wandering around at the track, but I wanted to see the horse race. So I went, and I was sitting in the bar waiting for the race, and I saw a guy that looked like him. And he was kind of swaggering like he had a horse in the race. And I thought, that kind of looks like him, I don't know if that's him. And then I got up closer to the guy, and he had his name on his belt buckle in diamonds. And I thought, okay, he's here, and he doesn't mind being seen. So I guess I'm a good reporter, but I'm very shy. So I was like, I gotta go up to him and introduce myself. I'd never met him. And I didn't, and then the race went off, and his horse won, and I still didn't introduce myself. But eventually, like before everything left, I went up to him and introduced myself, and I've never had somebody ignore me. So he just stared right over the top. He's taller than me, most people are. Stared right over the top of my head, and just completely ignored me with this look on his face, like, if you stand there any longer, I'm going to punch you right in the face. So I just kind of stammered and got out of the way. And there were a lot of conversations like that in researching this book, and none of them were fun, but they were all good.
Gosh, this is my Hotel Scarface. I could tell you pretty much my love-hate letter to my hometown where I grew up, Miami. I moved to Miami from Iran in 1978, just ahead of the revolution. My aunt was in medical school there. And I grew up in typical immigrant, stay in school, drink milk, say no to drugs lifestyle. And like the rest of America, on Friday nights, I'd taken Miami Vice, which was this, Hollywoodized simulacrum of what was apparently going on downtown. And I left to go up north to college in 1994, and right before I did, this story found me. I don't want to give away anything in the book. And it was one of those things that when you realized that there was a real possibility that this Westworld address existed, you had to have it. You could pick it up and put it down, and pick it up and put it down, and be fraught with doubt and exhilaration and anxiety and depression. And gosh, I'm on the chase. Over years, there'd be developments, and then, no, what the hell am I doing? I'm a finance reporter. I'm not, a memoirist of any sort. I'm not an insider. And a couple of big breakthroughs over the course of more than 20 years that finally resulted in my passing this massive kidney stone last year. I don't want to offend women by comparing it to childbirth, because I don't know what it's like. So, I felt like I was in a position to tell the story of how the real Cocaine Cowboys, 3 generations of Cuban refugees, fought for control of the cocaine trade, arguably out of this hotel, which was like the headquarters, the club. It was our Studio 54 and Rick's Bar American, and then some. One of the craziest things that happened to me, I think, I've been threatened several times, but once was one of these major wholesale dealers who worked with the Cali Cartel in the 1980s. He'd since gotten out of jail, and he told me, he asked me, what do you do? I was like, well, at the time I write for Business Week, and he said, do you make money? Do they pay you by the word? I was like, I get by with a little help from my friends and everything. He goes, let me tell you something. And so his latest gig was moving cheap cigarettes to Angola. And he says, if you can get me D2 diesel in quantity, you'll never have to work another day in your life. And it was a legitimate commerce thing, but it showed you that the smuggler, arbitrageur blood was always in this guy, right? You could put him in the prison system, but there was always going to be some sort of, prison of recidivism. So I thought I'd share that.
Thank you. I think what was really fascinating about reading the books is that in almost every single one of the books, it felt like it was a fictional story, because the stories themselves were so intriguing that you almost felt like this couldn't be real. So for example, with the hotel, why was this hotel allowed to stay open for so long given everything that was going on? So now I'm going to hand it back to you all to talk a little bit about your books and what it is about the book that you want us to know.
I'll go first because I called you out last time. Well, I told you a little bit about what it's about, and I think a good place to start is how I told you that I was casting around for stories, and how I stumbled on it and got into it. I was working at that newspaper and read this story in the New York Times. That's what you do a lot of times. You're looking for books or longer stories. Just like the newspaper is kind of your tip sheet. And oftentimes the stories are buried in the back. This one wasn't, it was on the front. It was a pretty good story actually. But it was a story essentially about this dramatic raid on a horse farm in Oklahoma. And these federal agents had stormed onto this ranch and seized hundreds of horses and arrested some people. And the horses in the ranch, on paper, were owned by this Mexican-American rancher named Jose Trevino, just sort of known as a well-respected rancher in town. But according to the government, the horses and the ranch were actually owned by Jose's little brother, Miguel, who was the leader of Los Zetas, this criminal organization I told you about. So, I was intrigued naturally, wanted to try to tell the story. So I did what journalists often do. I called the first step, you call the government and ask them about it. And sometimes they want to talk, sometimes they don't. They were motivated in this one, they wanted to tell the story, so they introduced me to this FBI agent, who I mentioned. He was a rookie when he had started the case. He was this strapping kind of cowboy himself from Tennessee. And this story started to form in my head. And that scene on the ranch that I had read about was kind of the peak of it, right? It was this strapping agent bursting onto the ranch to save these horses and save America or something. So I went about telling that story. And I did tell that story in the newspaper. And that's how these stories get told. And it's one of the interesting takeaways that I have from the book is that this kind of narrative cycle perpetuates, where you have like straight white male journalists like me want to tell a story about the drug war, and they go find another straight white male, in this case this FBI agent, to tell them the story, and we get the same story over and over again. We were talking about Narcos earlier, which is about this kind of like bumbling CIA agent who's kind of trampling through Colombia. Sicario is kind of the same thing. It's the movie that's purportedly about Mexico, but it's all told through the eyes of this beautiful white woman who doesn't understand why she's there. We see it in our daily newspapers and these in magazines, heroic DEA agents chasing El Chapo. So, and honestly, the story that I told in the newspaper was another one of those stories. And I essentially sold the book that way. But as I started working on the book, my editor and I, working together, kind of realized that we were falling into this storytelling trap, and we were going to tell the same story. So we started to think about how can we do it differently. And it was pretty easy. You just kind of look around. And if you take that moment at the ranch, basically all you had to do is swing the camera one way and find the owner of the ranch, Jose Trevino, who I told you about, who, while the agent was having his heroic moment, Jose was sitting on the lawn in his pajamas, handcuffed, with his wife, watching what to him was an American dream be whisked away in trailers. So we started to think a lot about him. And he's an interesting guy. He was born in Mexico, big family, 13 siblings. His dad had worked in the fields and had come across, and it was at a time when you could easily come across work, bring your money back to your family in Mexico. Jose had a different experience. He came illegally in around 1980 and went to Dallas and started making his life as a bricklayer. And his brothers came too, and they bought houses together, and they started to build these kind of foundations of an American life. And then basically slowly, one by one, his brothers got sucked back into the smuggling trade in Mexico. And one ended up in an American prison, two ended up dead, and a couple of them sort of rose through the ranks of these trafficking organizations in Mexico, including his brother, Miguel, who eventually became the leader of Los Zetas. And through all of this, and I expected to find differently, but as it turns out, through all of this, over decades, Jose just stuck with bricklaying. He got married, he became an American citizen, he bought a house, he raised 4 kids, and he laid bricks. And he never got sort of tempted by, or I guess I don't know if he was tempted by, but he never got sucked into that world with his brothers. And eventually a couple things happened. His oldest daughter had graduated from an American high school and was getting ready to go to college, and it wasn't clear how they were going to pay for it because they never had any money. And his brother Miguel asked him a favor. So his brother Miguel, back in Mexico, had become obsessed, as a lot of these traffickers are, with racing quarter horses. Are people familiar with what quarter horses are and quarter horse racing? Quarter horse racing is basically invented like right here by the colonists. They would take their horses and run them straight down the track for a quarter of a mile. It eventually migrated to the Southwest and into Mexico, and it's kind of the sport of cowboys to thoroughbreds sport of kings. It's like they've got new juleps. Quarter horse racing has like Tecate. Everybody gets drunk and gambles. I guess that's kind of the same. The races are shorter and a little more violent, and it's fun. And it's big in Mexico in the Southwest. And the drug traffickers love it. They race against each other. Miguel would just buy the fastest horses he could find and race anybody who would race them. They bet $100,000 a pop. They would let him win because they were genuinely afraid he would kill them if they didn't. He mostly did it in Mexico, but at this time, around 2009, he decided he had these horses that were really fast, including this one that was really skinny, so skinny that they called it El Huesos, which means bones, which is where the title comes from. He wanted to race it in the United States. So he had his guys smuggle it into the United States, and he asked the only person he had in the United States who had a clean record and who he could trust to be the owner of it. And that was his brother Jose. So one of the themes and one of the big takeaways from the book, it's about choice, and it's about this choice that a lot of people in Mexico and Mexican Americans here face because of the drug traders, which is what do you do? What do you do when the drug lord comes around and asks you to give him your ranch, sell him your ranch, train his horses, breed his horses, own one of his horses? And what do you do in particular if the drug lord happens to be your brother? So I wouldn't have a book if Jose said no. He said yes, spoiler alert. And his story just sort of takes off from there. And he has a lot of success owning these horses that he says he paid for. The government says he didn't. You can read the book and try to, see what you think. But it becomes this interesting story about this group of Mexican and Mexican-American horsemen who love racing horses and who say that they were just racing horses, and who the government swears they were trying to launder this money for the cartel, and the FBI can sort of sees it all through. I think the big takeaway for me is at the end of it, 18 people were charged, and all 18 of them in this very diverse industry were Mexican and Mexican-American. And so it becomes a story about the biases baked into the system and our own biases as storytellers.
Thank you. Emily, do you want to go next?
Sure. So my book is about the history of activism surrounding marijuana, people who are working both for and against the drug. And I think that the most important thing to take away from Grassroots is that every major change in America's marijuana laws, whether they have been more lenient towards the drug or have recriminalized the drug, those haven't come from pronouncements from presidents or first ladies or Congress or wherever. They come from average Americans, right? People who they cared enough about the drug to actually take to the streets, essentially, which is what was really fascinating to me when I was researching this book, the people who just cared enough to really do it. There's been 3 shifts of the pendulum so far, from the first protest for legalization in 1964 to today, where the drug has been made more lenient, the laws have been made more lenient in the decriminalization period in the 1970s, to the recriminalization period in the 1980s, to now a far more lenient approach to it again from the 1990s to today as far as medical and now recreational marijuana is concerned. But the thing is, the pendulum never stops swinging, right? So we have about 9 states that have legalized with Washington, D.C., and 29 states that have medical marijuana laws and D.C. And a lot of people who are working very hard for legalization assume that, well, this is it, right? Like we've tipped it over, and legalization is our future. And a lot of people are betting on that. Particularly, you can see the governor of New Jersey is really working for that now because of a lot of concerns about money. legal marijuana raises a lot of money for states, a lot of tax dollars. And there's a huge argument right now for social justice. For the most part, those who have been arrested for marijuana in the past 30 years are overwhelmingly people of color and overwhelmingly men, right? So people have been promoting the legalization of marijuana as a social justice issue. In the same way that in the 1970s, people were promoting the decriminalization of marijuana as a way to prevent otherwise law-abiding citizens from going to jail, removing them from the tax-paying sort of milieu of otherwise law-abiding citizens. When laws were being passed to recriminalize the drug in the 1980s, the conversation shifted. It was no longer about this adult who was using this drug in the privacy of his or her own home. It was about the right of a child to grow up drug-free. And that's incredibly important. Whoever is at the center of the arguments about marijuana laws is always the most sympathetic face possible, right? It's the college kid in the 1960s and 70s. It's the child like Punky Brewster in the 1980s, a very special episode, if anyone's familiar with that, to the HIV/AIDS patient in the 1980s, which was one of the reasons why the first medical marijuana laws passed in the 90s, to now the incarcerated, oftentimes African-American male today, whose image is pushing legalization. This idea that marijuana laws specifically need to change because they are particularly harmful to certain individuals, and certain individuals will benefit the most from changes in these laws, has been what's been pushing these changes in laws and has been pushing people into the streets to change these laws for the past 40 years. But this pendulum hasn't stopped. Already a counter-revolution to today's legalization movement is forming. It's fairly weak at the moment, but it is forming and will continue to form. And I guess that's, the thing that I think is probably the most important is that pot's never just about pot. And I use the term pot, marijuana, cannabis, weed, etc. I use them all. I'm an equal opportunity marijuana name caller, I suppose. Because it's never just about the drug itself. Conversations about marijuana are always about so many other topics. It's about identity, it's about freedom, it's about privacy, it's about danger, it's about public health, it's about equality, it's about freedom, it's about all these other things. It's almost Freudian in that a pipe is oftentimes not a pipe, in the same way that marijuana is oftentimes never about marijuana. In the United States, when we have conversations about this drug in particular, it's never just about the drug itself. This drug is unique in that it is the only substance, the only intoxicating substance other than alcohol, that has moved back and forth between criminality and legalization repeatedly, over and over the course of, 100 years. Alcohol, of course, is very different. When we had a 13-year prohibition period that both began and ended with constitutional amendments. We have no such thing right now for marijuana. So the ability of marijuana to shift as far as legalization is concerned at the state level and remain federally legal, remains a Schedule I drug regardless of what these 9 states and DC consider it, is probably the most remarkable thing about it. As a substance, it is the thing that most inspires people to take to the streets, and it is the one intoxicating substance that we can't seem to make up our minds about. And so I was really honored to be able to tell the story of myriad individuals who decided to make changing marijuana laws their life's work, and I had a lot of really fascinating conversations with them. So, yeah, that's it.
What was the question? I was so struck in reporting this. I mean, the seduction and the subject of that seduction was the hotel and the address and my childhood and nostalgia. But once you get to the nitty-gritty of the story and the brass tacks of it, is I became a true student of history and how kind of the Cold War crashed into, like I say, reefer madness and the cocaine wars. I just finished reading a book by T.J. English called The Corporation. It's a history of the Cuban Mafia and the Bolita Wars. Having it on my show this week. And his other book, Havana Nocturne, How the Mob Won and Lost Cuba, was so influential. I mean, how many people here, Americans, know that pre-revolutionary Cuba was like this Vegas in the Caribbean? That, I mean, man on the street, if you ask people, they have no idea. They thought Fidel Castro came in there, but it was a kleptocracy. It was run by the mob. The Jewish mafia was there, the Italian mafia was there. A lot of the exiles who came to Miami were flushed out of the revolution, and they saw their land taken away, they saw their treasures. They saw their brothers and uncles put up against the wall and shot. They became natural allies of the mob and the CIA by the time they came to Miami. And I wonder, going back, that if John F. Kennedy had finished the job at the Bay of Pigs in 1961, how different history would have been, how cocaine would have come to America. Because what happened instead was Miami becomes the biggest CIA station in the hemisphere. You have thousands and thousands of Cuban men, young men and men, just preparing for the fait accompli of going out and taking out the SOB, the bearded SOB in Havana. And when they were abandoned in 61, when Kennedy didn't finish the job, he comes back to the Orange Bowl, he accepts the flag of the brigade, and he says, I promise you this will be restored to Havana. That never happened. A year later, he's dead. And LBJ is in no mood to prioritize taking out this guy who now had the Cuban Missile Crisis behind him. And so I was going to call the first third of the book Sublimation, and that reminded me of psych class, and that when you don't get to do something, exert your energy in a certain way, whether it's sexual frustration or violence, if you can channel it to a productive means. A lot of these guys who were trained to know the coastline so well, Emily, I mean, the CIA trained them to know Florida's thousands of miles of coastline. They saw moving pot in the 60s and 70s as child's play. And they thought of it as an amazing consolation prize. If you're not going to restore our homeland to us, we're going to make a crap ton of money selling pot. And then what happens after pot is pound for pound, ounce for ounce, when cocaine comes to town in the 70s, it becomes far more profitable. Moreover, a lot of these marijuaneros, the pot cowboys, thought that Jimmy Carter was going to legalize this stuff. I mean, the price was plunging. You gotta move up the food chain to the far more profitable commodity. Cocaine, I mean, if you could get your mitts on it for $500 to $5,000, the paste in the Andes, by the time the street value was fully appreciated in Miami, that kilo was worth more than $500,000. Has mankind ever known a commodity that valuable? Not in Deadwood, South Dakota, nowhere else. And so that kind of frustration and these people biding their time and the violence with cocaine added as an accelerant, and then you throw in sex and this hotel, just blew my mind to see the sublimation of that anger and that revenge into all of these different animal spirits by the early 80s. When you talk to these kingpins, one of them, for example, went around town, a really violent person with a pet chimp, chomping on a Cuban cigar and wearing heavy gold chains, and would ride in the front shotgun of his Mercedes. Yeah, the chimp. And you say, isn't that strange? Say, those were the cocaine days, man. It's like, they ask Rick James in Charlie Murphy's True Hollywood Stories. He says cocaine's a hell of a drug. And for a town to collectively lose its mind, to lose its rationality, to lose sight of the initial injustice of, our homeland was to be restored, cocaine was one hell of a consolation prize. I mean, the victors of this book, if you can call them victors, when the government caught up with them in '91 and alleged more than a $2 billion conspiracy, they were the biggest cocaine dealers in the biggest cocaine town in Miami, and money was no object. They were using gold bullion as paperweights. And this hotel, where one of the most extravagant things you could do was take a bath in Dom Perignon, just to telegraph to the world that money was no object, that I could quite literally pour 40 grand down the tub. 40 grand means nothing to me. These people right now, many of whom are on Medicare, they've lost all their money. All they have is the name that they carried in the late 70s and 80s. It's striking to sit there and talk to them. And then, by the way, they want to hit you up for $1,000 if you could spot them. So for me, it was such a treat and an adventure to embed myself in this and look at the arc and the rise and fall of cocaine.
Thank you. I have so many questions, but I'm going to put it out to you guys because I know you also have questions. So here's your opportunity. Again, remember, if you have a question, please raise your hand and somebody will come around with a microphone.
I was wondering if each of you would be willing and able to read a section of your book that is especially meaningful to you.
I'm not sure that we will have enough time, but maybe we can take a few more questions, and then if we have some time at the end, we can do it.
I was going to just say yes. She's the boss.
Hi, I was wondering, do any of you see an end to the war on drugs, or at least the decriminalization of Class A drugs like marijuana? And if so, what would your prediction be within what sort of time period? Next 10 years, 15?
Oh, cool. Look at me. Okay, well, I don't see the war on drugs ending anytime super soon. So when I finished my manuscript in March-ish, and then the book was released in December because publishing takes a long time, I predicted that no. Actually, I knew that Trump got elected. I had to, of course, I had to finish it all up after the election because that was key. So I wrote the final conclusion after the election, and in it I predicted that Attorney General Jeff Sessions would overturn the Cole memo, which was a memo written in 2013 after the first legalization laws passed by Assistant Attorney General James Cole, that said the federal government was going to allow state legalization laws to stand, assuming that they worked within reason. No marijuana was grown on federal lands, it wasn't going to be trafficked across state lines, it wasn't going to be sold to children, it wasn't going to be used to benefit cartels and things like that, which I should say all state laws have very much so abided by, except for that state trafficking thing, because try keeping pot within one state. Good luck. So the Cole memo, that's not law, it's a memo. And I said that as soon as Trump got elected, Sessions could very easily overturn a memo, again, because it's not a law. My book was released on December 5th. California legalized or opened its first, the doors to its first dispensaries on January 1st, and Sessions overturned the Cole memo on January 4th. So my book was out for less than a month before I predicted correctly that Sessions was going to do that. Now, it was so much saber rattling, right? He said, okay, no more Cole memo. We are going to target, these federal, these marijuana laws. But the thing is, 95% of drug arrests occur at the state level, which has nothing to do with the federal government. Only really large traffickers are ever going to be targeted by the federal government. And for the most part, in nearly 3 months since Sessions has overturned the Cole memo, really nothing has happened. And actually, last week he was talking to a bunch of FBI agents in Tennessee and said, I'm never going to tell anyone that pot is legal, but these laws are standing in Colorado, these laws are standing in Washington, we're going to continue to allow them. But the symbolic overturning of the Cole memo, the symbolic attack on states' rights to legalize this drug should they choose to do so, was very meaningful and important. And that's the real core, that's essentially the essence, I think, of what the war on drugs, especially concerning marijuana, is. It's a symbolic battle against what we think this drug is going to be, or the harm that it can potentially cause and things like that. Now, there are a lot of countries that are decriminalizing, for the most part, the majority of drugs. You see that happening in Portugal, you see that happening in, I think Uruguay has recently decriminalized all of marijuana and things like that. There are, of course, global examples of how this is happening, but the United States is not, it remains, in essence, a Puritan nation, right? So I don't see, I love that name someone else, that was awesome. I don't see it happening on a widespread, this wave of legalization. And I see that not happening for a number of reasons. Save for Vermont, all of the states that have legalized have done so through ballot initiative, which are only available in about half of the states. So the rest of the states have to go through the state legislature, which is a far more convoluted, oftentimes more conservative process. Over 50% of the state governors are Republican, and they're oftentimes opposed to legalization. Marijuana will not change from a Schedule I drug anytime soon. That would require an act of Congress, which is not willing to do so. And Congress is going to pass the ball to the FDA, the DEA, HHS, and the Food and Drug Administration, which they're, have no interest in doing. There are these little steps that are being taken on the state level. The Farm Bill of 2014 allowed for some growth of hemp. We were talking about that in our panel last night. But it is such a piecemeal process and a very short-term process, and a process that can be very easily overturned. A ballot initiative passed in a state that legalizes marijuana can be overturned by a ballot initiative that's going to recriminalize the drug. A state legislature could say, we don't agree with the will of the people, we're going to recriminalize the drug anyway, which is what happened in decriminalization in the 70s. All of these things are incredibly tenuous and oftentimes short-lived. So if marijuana is any indication of the state of the drug war, it remains very much so a battle that is very is going on. So I'm sorry for anyone who's like, oh, the end of the war on drugs is imminent. I don't think so. I'm sorry.
Any other opinions on that question, or should we take another question?
I agree, and I would say that's just weed. So if you start thinking about cocaine, heroin, meth, etc., they're such a powerful, the war on drugs is such a powerful political tool that I'm not saying it'll never happen, I just can't foresee it. I don't have any way of conceptualizing what it would look like. And in any time
In our lifetime.
that's of interest to me.
Sorry. 2370,
Yeah,
war on drugs is going to be over.
That's a good question.
Did any of you find in your research and reporting, as you're interviewing or reading about someone, that you were starting to align with them or find yourself surprised about who you were sympathetic to, or did you ever have to pretend in certain roles to get more information?
In my book, there were really no true, white hat protagonists. Everybody was sullied to a certain extent. From the continuum of corruption to murder to worse, and revenge. But you had to keep reminding yourself that you were, in my case, a trespasser into their lives. And statute of limitations outside of, protects them outside of murder, of course. But as much as they try to kind of get me to empathize, for example, one of the main characters of this book was this star accounting student, a Federal Reserve all-star. He got a full security clearance in the mid-'70s in Miami, and he got a scholarship at the University of Miami to be an accounting student. He was top of his class, and he did this glide path into becoming a cocaine kingpin, and many means man in Miami. And there's a lot that's relatable. In a kind of a wistful moment at the end, he's like, I just remember how much $5 an hour meant to me when I was at the Federal Reserve. That was a lot of money, man, and I impressed my parents so much. They had nothing from Cuba. Could you imagine where I'd be now if I was at the Fed, the most important bank in the world? And you just want to, another one, for example, was a salutatorian at Boston University, and his heart's broken. He didn't get into Harvard Law. It's the only school he applied to. Has a nervous breakdown. Next thing he knows, he's transacting cocaine at the Muni Hotel. And he's constantly in tears. He just turned 60. My brother's not talking to me. My parents have passed. What do I have? I have these war stories. I'm on Medicaid. And you always have to remind yourself to kind of stand outside of that. And a lot of these people, it took a lot of convincing to get them to let me into the inner sanctum and to share that candor with me. But you have to keep your cold eyes.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. That was kind of a lot of my experience in researching this book. I mentioned how I had started off with this FBI agent, and I'd sort of conceived him the way that I feel like my brain has been trained to conceive stories, which is like, okay, here's my hero, and they say that this guy sitting on the lawn is laundering this money, so he's obviously, I honestly assumed that he had spent the previous 30 years posing as a bricklayer while laundering his brother's money or moving his brother's drugs and whatever. It was just a matter of I expected my research to take me to the place where I was unraveling that. Like, how had he been doing this all along? And a lot of those preconceptions were flipped throughout the process of working on the book. The FBI agent and I was texting with him a couple of days ago. He is not some unvarnished hero of the book, but we had a nice relationship, and I can see where he's coming from, and I think he's a good agent and a good guy. But our relationship definitely changed from me being like, tell me how you did it, and to really challenging him. And I was lucky to have, as a source, an FBI agent who was willing to have those conversations with me. And then with a lot of the people who were involved on the, I guess I would say on the horse side of things, the trainers, the breeders, etc., and including guys who were doing work with and around this organization, as I heard their story, I came to not to empathize with them, even if I didn't exactly believe them in their version of it, or with some of them believe them, and with some of them to see their version of the story eventually be true according to how the courts saw it. You know, so we had some people who, when I first came into it, was like, oh, here was he was training the Cartels horses, and that's obviously what he's done. And by the end, me and their lawyers and the courts were saying, well, what they were doing was not illegal. So that was a lot of my experience, was sort of coming in thinking, okay, here's the good guys, here's the bad guys, and then watching that just get turned upside down.
I think too in the book, one of the things that stood out to me was you talk about here are the good guys, here are the bad guys, but then you also talk about how the government, for example, decided who the good guys were, who the bad guys were, who could be an informant versus who was not allowed to be an informant. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, it was one of the things that I was really grappling with and trying to explain, and it's hard to do. But I mentioned the sort of biases and implicit biases in law enforcement. And so what I was trying to do with this agent is understand, okay, so you sort of ride into this industry, and drug money at that time, and probably still today, touched every aspect of this very diverse industry. And this is an industry in the Southwest where you have some of the wealthiest ranchers and other businessmen who own horses, own tracks, own whatever. And then you have obviously the guys in the stalls who are mucking the stuff. And drug money touched all of it. And so I was trying to understand, like, okay, so you come in here, how do you decide who is just sort of accidentally stumbled into this, and so you can kind of go up to them and tell them, hey, you made a mistake, but if you help us, we'll get you out of it. And who do you decide like, no, I'm going to let you do this for 2 years while talking to these other guys, and you're going to do it, and then in the end, we're going to arrest you. And, and it was interesting. I mean, they don't have a good answer for that. In the FBI's handbook, it says that they can use race as a factor in determining who is a part of a conspiracy. So if it's a Mexican criminal organization, the fact that somebody is Mexican, that just doesn't automatically make them a part of the organization, but they can use that as a factor in trying to make those connections. And so what happens is they explain them in these very subjective ways. Like this agent would say to me, well, you watch how they behave after they get involved, and do they change the way you're acting? And it's like, well, that's entirely up to your perception of the situation, and you're lugging incredible biases to that. And so the end result is that informant who I told you about, like, here was a guy who had started down this road. You had these two guys, really, Jose and Tyler, who had been involved with this horse and kind of started down this road. And to simplify it, the FBI essentially rolls in and they say, hey, you got involved in this thing, but if you tell us about it, you're going to be fine. And that's what leads all the way to that scene that I told you guys about, where he's racing horses and he's got his name on his belt and is winning races and is being a jerk to me. And then a whole bunch of other guys who all happen to be Mexican and Mexican-American, not all of whom are related to the drug lord, the FBI doesn't say anything to you. They're talking to Tyler, they're letting them do their thing, and then one day they're on their doorstep. And so, they don't have a good system for making those choices. It's all completely subjective and totally subject to their own biases.
Do we have any other questions? We have one in the...
Just an aside to my question, I was reading last week about the research recently done in Portugal, finding that it has a roughly 10% interest in drugs, lower than any other country in the world. I read that last week. My question is about, for Emily, is in your research, did you see the import of the imposition by Richard Nixon of Operation Intercept, which in the New York suburbs in the early and mid-60s, marijuana was making inroads from the city up into the suburbs, and all of a sudden, come Operation Intercept, the marijuana became much more difficult to get. And what happened, of course, was the heroin and the cocaine came up out of the city in droves, which it never would have done had Operation Intercept not reduced the supply of marijuana, which all suburban kids were doing.
Yeah, totally interesting historical moment there. Operation Intercept was 1969, right? And it was something that Nixon really promoted as one of his big successes. He was able to, use various agents down along the border to stop the influx of marijuana coming up from Mexico. And there were a lot of other things going on at the time as well. There was the use of paraquat being sprayed on Mexican marijuana fields and all this other stuff. But for the most part, America's heroin epidemic in the 1960s and 70s lasted from about 1967 to 1976. You can remember it because you just switch the numbers. 67, 76, easy to remember. And when marijuana all of a sudden became less available, and these other drugs were continually more available, of course, because the French Connection was still a go and things like that, that was obviously a relationship. One of the biggest effects of the heroin epidemic lasting at the same time, that are going on at the same time that America's feelings about marijuana were changing, was that when the heroin epidemic was going on, marijuana, of course, seemed incredibly tame in comparison, which really pushed a lot of people to support the passage of these decriminalization laws, which passed in a dozen states containing about a third of the country between 1973 and 1978. So there's this constant ongoing relationship between what drugs are being used and what drugs aren't being used, what drugs are available and what drugs aren't available, and how they all sort of exist in this same field together, in the same world together. One of the reasons I think that marijuana legalization laws are so popular today is because of the ongoing opioid epidemic. When you have over 64,000 people dying a year of overdoses, and you have marijuana being promoted as a potential pain reliever, panacea, or alternative to opioids, it once again seems like this option that we should really be embracing, as opposed to, these prescription pills that lead people toward heroin when the prescription pills are no longer available. So Operation Intercept was sort of an earlier version of what we see happening today. Evidence that we learned nothing from the past. So it's going on, but yeah, Operation Intercept is a really fascinating moment. And Nixon is, of course, one of the most interesting presidents to read about when you're studying marijuana. The guy who calls it, all sorts of names in those Oval Office tapes. So interesting that he recorded everything that he said.
So my question is, I'm really fascinated by the research that you guys have done on all this. That must have been a very intrinsically gratifying thing for all of you. I'm going to direct this one specifically to Roben. I'm sure, being a Miami native and an interest in this topic, that you went into your research with certain expectations as to what to expect from your subjects that you're interviewing in terms of the magnitude, in this case, of the ostentatiousness and debauchery, if you will. My question to you is, in retrospect and after the fact, was what you found commensurate with what your expectations were after meeting with these people? Less, more, and can you elaborate on that?
They were a lot more human, less caricature than I had expected. What's amazing to me is you walk into Miami right now. If I flew you to Miami International Airport and we took an Uber to Coral Way and sat down and had evening early bird dinner at Sergio's or Denny's, I could point to a booth over there that had two of the most infamous, freebase barons, nefarious people from the late 70s, who are old Cuban guys in tube socks right now. And a lot of these guys, you talk about sublimation, have since moved on into healthcare fraud, Medicare fraud, home HIV systems. I mean, it's one gig to another. One character, for example, which everybody thought he was either hiding in the jungles of the Amazon or was relocated somewhere, I found him under very quotidian circumstances, and there was this courtship to kind of get the story out of me, and was he going to have photos from Dealey Plaza and the grassy knoll and everything, and in the end he was broke and he wanted $10,000 from me. And so it's this constant, you were spoon-fed Scarface and Miami Vice and everything else from that, and you come with expectations to it, and it becomes like real life imitating art, which was kind of imitating life. One of the Mariel refugees in the book, his nickname is Coca-Cola Hero, was a national bicycling champ of Cuba, and he became a huge cocaine dealer within 5 years of coming to South Florida. It's completely bluffed his way into it. When they finally found his stash house, what had the DEA all miffed was all of these photos that he had. He was posing like Tony Montana from Scarface. He had his head in a mound of cocaine. He had 17 Rolexes. I mean, Tony Montana, in turn, was what Brian De Palma and Oliver Stone was their impression of the mutiny in Miami. And so this stuff was transmogrified thousands of miles away in Burbank and in Universal and in Long Island and in Rockefeller Center. And coming back to South Florida, and a real-life Cuban refugee, Marielito, like a real-life Tony Montana, thinks he has to ape these things. And so in many ways, it's gone kind of full circle for me. And then one last thing is so many of these guys, especially after you get a couple of beers into them, they end the evening saying, Tony Montana is based on me. And by the time like the 50th person is claiming that, you're onto something.
So let's take one final question.
So you guys don't know this, but just before you, there was a neuropsychologist talking about income inequality and how that can potentiate or amplify risk-taking in commerce or money decisions and in health decisions. It was very interesting. So one of the things that came out of that is how in our current society or communities of income inequality, that has the potential of generating more interest in the risk-taking aspects of drug trade or commerce or trafficking, as well as developing consumers or users or abusers. So that's an interesting combination if you want to comment on it, but also from reflection. Would you comment on, from all these stories, do you have any inkling that if in states or if the nation were to go to decriminalization further or more expansively, that this risk-taking, this transgressive, unlawful behavior would subside?
Well, to speak to your second question, in states that have legalized marijuana, the big concern, of course, was, well, is the sky going to fall? Are kids all of a sudden going to be using it, like in record numbers or whatever? And the difference between decriminalization and legalization is that legalization allows for myriad forms of regulation and oversight to be placed upon this industry. It's a brand new industry. It's never been legal before. So every state's trying to kind of figure out what it's doing, and most states that have legalized in sort of subsequent years after Colorado and Washington were our trailblazers, have built upon the flaws that they've seen in previous state laws. In all of them, rates of adolescent marijuana use have either stayed stable or have actually dropped. And this is because legalization makes dispensaries very hard for adolescents to get into. You have to show an ID. The ID is like checked really closely. There's basically bouncers. You have to pay in cash. The drug is very expensive because there's multiple layers of taxes placed upon it. And for the most part, because it's primarily being sold to people who are over 21, mostly it's baby boomers who are dealing with a lot of health issues, it's not like cool to smoke pot anymore. Like if grandpa's doing it, like the teenager's not gonna go near it, right? Like, no, I'm sorry, my mom does that. Like, no, right? So the sky hasn't fallen in legalized states. So, if more people are going to take risks because the drug is more quote-unquote available, that's not necessarily true, at least as far as adolescents are concerned. Because legalization puts so many barriers in place of actually accessing the drug. The decriminalization in the 70s did in place. The corner dealer doesn't check IDs. That would really cut into his or her bottom line. As far as income inequality making people take risks, I think you guys probably have more to say about that than I do.
Well, I mean, I think it's an interesting point, and it sounded like a really cool panel just hearing about it. And I guess I would just say that it anecdotally tracks with all of the stories that I heard from people when I was talking, and a lot of their risk-taking behaviors were honestly like, So I talked to plenty of traffickers, and they all came from poverty, and they were all in these situations where there was a complete absence of choice for them. They lived in these communities where there were rich and powerful people, and then there was them. And it was a little bit complicated by for them, the risk-taking activity would have been to say no. It wasn't a real choice for a lot of them. Or if it was a very complicated choice, because it was either do what you were asked to do or make a run for it. But that's really interesting, and it makes a lot of sense.
I think it also brings into question how different groups would define risk. Because if you're the kid who's making the decision as to whether or not you're going to run drugs, maybe you see risk in one way, versus if you're the wealthy millionaire, you're also taking risks, but you're also shielding yourself in different ways.
Yeah.
So we're out of time for questions, but I wanted to give the authors an opportunity to ask questions to each other if they had any of those.
I have questions, yeah, if we have time.
So maybe we can do that for a few minutes before we have to transition into book signings and talking one-on-one with audience members and so on.
You touched on it a little bit, but I actually was curious about in your research sort of the myths or guesses about what's going to happen in these places where we legalize marijuana, and I'm curious if you could speak to a couple of the ones that jump out to you. I'm assuming they're going to be myths that that we found like, no, this isn't happening. Although maybe there are some things that people said, oh, this is going to happen if we legalize weed, and in fact it is happening, and it's troublesome, and we need to kind of correct for it.
The two biggest things were adolescent use, and for the most part that hasn't been happening. Actually, there was a big study done in Oregon. A bunch of undercover researchers or what have you went into a ton of different dispensaries, and they got 100 dispensaries to see if the dispensary would sell to someone under 21. 0% did. So, hooray, Oregon, you know? So that's been a myth that's been busted. The myth that legalization would somehow erase racism in America, that by legalizing marijuana, cops would no longer arrest people based on the color of their skin, or that these very racist arrest rates would somehow disappear. The legalization would somehow take away 400 years of systemic racism. That has not proven to be the case. I know, I'm shocked too, isn't it amazing that somehow it didn't happen. Pot isn't what makes America racist, right? It would be so great if it were just this one thing that we just legalized it all of a sudden.
Emily, does any cop really want to arrest somebody for smoking a joint? I mean, I see a lot of it now is salutary neglect. Like, put that away. Like, if you're going to do that, man, just go do it in the car. It's become so...
It's just an excuse, right? If you're busting someone who's smoking publicly, you've been targeting this person for a while for numerous other things. This is a person who's been, targeted by the cops for X, Y, and Z, and all of a sudden they have a joint, and you're like, there it is. But even so, in legalized states, there's still a racial difference in arrest rates. People are arrested for smoking in public because, legalized states aren't Amsterdam. We don't have smokers' lounges or cafes or coffee shops or whatever. So if you're smoking in public, it's still a legal offense. Particularly in DC, where I'm from, 26% of the city is federal land. So if you're caught smoking, or if you have anything on you on the National Mall or around any of those buildings and things like that, that's still a federal offense, which is like here as opposed to a state offense, which is down there. So you continue to see the same problems, continue on and on and on. For the most part, the people who own legal marijuana industries are white and male. So, there's not a lot of people who are entering into the industry where you're seeing a lot of diversity, you're seeing a lot of equality, you're seeing this overwhelming number of women and people of color coming in and saying like, hey, this is a place that's welcoming to me. The problems of America have trickled down to, the marijuana industry. We haven't eradicated them. So the myth that legalization is this, full ride into social justice is probably the biggest myth that needs to be busted. It's just, it's the commercialization of it is probably going to continue to benefit those who have the money and access to the industry that should come as no surprise are for the most part wealthy white individuals who have access to a number of other industries as well. So I guess that's it's a bummer.
Is there any way to make money in book publishing?
Man, you guys are rolling in dough? 'Cause
You gotta sell the movie rights. You sold the movie
So
rights.
I guess that is a good segue into inviting the audience members to buy some books. They don't care. The authors will be available to sign copies. You can talk to them afterwards. Thank you all for coming. Please don't forget to fill out those evaluation forms.